Whoops. Now we're live. Hello, everyone. The designated hour having arrived, I call to order this regular meeting of Ansel Glink's Quorum Forum podcast, the podcast local governments need to do business. In the chair, it's me, Daniel J. Bolin. On the agenda today, we're down on the Statement of Economic Interests farm, where we grow the finest Statement of Economic Interest forms that money can buy. Folks have been hog calling us saying, "Sue." That's an acronym for Statement of Economic Interest, SOEI. And they've been saying, when they're hog calling us, that this year's form is way more invasive than the weeds in my cornfield. Well, I'm here to tell you that if you read the questions and the definitions very carefully, the form will be a little easier to answer. And that's what we're going to do here today. I said it'll be easier to answer. It won't be easy to answer, but we're going to do our best to help you through it today. But first, let's take the role. We have an equity partner here at Ansel Glink. She spent her entire career representing Illinois local governments and their officials in their day-to-day matters that arise, including corporate matters, labor and employment matters, tax objections, as well as in litigation. She lives on a farm, and we're going to ask her about it. Carrie Lynn Krafteffer is here.
Present.
Carrie Lynn, tell us what's going on with life down on the farm.
Life down on the farm is pretty good. We don't know if it's summer or winter or fall because right now we experience kind of the changes in weather all day, and things are shifting in the wind as they always are when the General Assembly is in session adopting new laws related to updating the Statement of Economic Interest form. And I think, the purpose for these particular changes was to torment elected officials, and we can talk a little more about that. But yeah, life on the farm is good.
Yeah, that's good. Animal cruelty bad. That's glad to hear it. We want to navigate these statements of economic interest as painlessly as we can, and we'll be talking more about it. We're also joined by our local government friends here in the live stream on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter.com. Please share your questions or compliments for the host in the chat or in the comments. We'll try to answer some of them as we go. Questions that include flattering comments for the host are more likely to be answered. So please keep that in mind when you're entering your questions in the chat. Behind the virtual glass for our protection, engineer Rick is present. We have a quorum. Dear listener, we're going to review the definitions and the questions on the new Statement of Economic Interest form. But first, don't just listen to us. The Act encourages filers to prepare their forms in reasonable good faith reliance on guidance from the Secretary of State. As a result, a Statement of Economic Interest filers should review that Secretary of State guidance. We'll include a link to it in the show notes to this episode. And let me, over the past several weeks, every week I would call the index department down in Springfield, and there were very helpful staff there and said, our legal department is working on it. It'll be out next week. And it seemed like they told me that guidance would be ready every week for a number of weeks. It's like when you go to a dive bar and it's like free beer tomorrow. But you know what? It finally did arrive. The guidance is here, but the reviews are in. It answers maybe exactly zero of the questions that we've been getting from people about the Statement of Economic Interest form. So you should review the guidance because you're supposed to rely on it. But we're going to try to address some of the questions that folks have been having about the new form. But before we do that, we should touch on what hasn't changed, and that includes who's required to file the Statement of Economic Interest form. Carrie Lynn, maybe you could tell us about some of that.
Okay, well, as you know, the General Assembly originally adopted this law so that we could torment people who are otherwise trying to serve the public, right? So we thought that it was not possible for them to make the form worse than it was because it was fairly incomprehensible to start out with. But you need to file this form if you are an elected or appointed official. of a unit of local government in Illinois. And sometimes we get questions about what even does that mean? Does that mean that every single employee of a unit of local government has to file? No, it means that if you're an elected or appointed official, you have to file this form, and that has not changed, as Dan has said. Now, I guess maybe what we should also briefly talk about, Dan, is just kind of the mass paranoia and confusion and distress and emotional turmoil that has has kind of come about when these changes came about, because we have been receiving phone calls from public bodies where, for example, their whole entire elected board is going to resign wholesale because of this form, or we've had completely appointed plan commissions where they're all quitting because they don't want to fill out the form. Because the form, like the Cliff Notes version of what we're going to talk about today, is really that this form requires you basically to disclose everything you own or have thought about owning in the future, with the exception that there are exceptions, which mean you don't have to disclose most of what you own or you thought about owning. So that's kind of what we want to dive into here. But as far as what has not changed, the timeline for filing hasn't changed. It's
Right.
still due on May 1st. And that's why we're having this seminar now, to kind of walk people through all of this. And the obligation of who has to file has not changed.
Right. And every time I do training for planning and plan commissions and zoning boards, there's at least like one or two people in the room like, oh, gee whiz, I gotta fill out this form. I didn't know I was a required filer. Now, not every appointed board, advisory boards and commissions, you may not be required to file. And I think that some organizations are taking closer look at who they're asking to file these forms. Especially with the new form being considered so onerous as it is. But yeah, elected officials, candidates, appointed officials, and then only certain employees, which is a good point that you raised, Carrie Lynn, about typically like department heads, those that have adjudicative authority, spending authority, or a lot of supervisory responsibility. But you got to take a close look at the statute to see whether you're required to file. But again, that hasn't changed with this new form. So very likely, if you filed in the past, you have to file in the future. And if you're a local government official, you're probably experienced with filing this with your county clerk.
Yeah,
And
there's
what,
as
go
far
ahead.
as the employees, there's like 6 different categories of employees. But as you know, if you've been through this process before, you usually get a list from the county regarding your people who are required to file. We haven't really discussed candidates' obligations to file because they already know that, because if they're running for this election right now, they just have done that. But if you have any question about whether you fall in the category of an appointed official that's required to file or an employee that's required to file, review those definitions and obligations with your legal counsel.
Good advice. Definitely, especially with these new form. Definitely review this with your legal counsel, and if your organization has an ethics officer, talk to your ethics officer too. Not a whole lot to, but something that to consider when you're preparing these forms. Carrie Lynn, any final thoughts on what hasn't changed before we dive into these questions here? Or at least maybe vamp for a couple seconds while I get this PowerPoint back up. Listeners
Yeah,
at home,
so
I have a PowerPoint.
what has not changed is that the form is still pretty much incomprehensible. And one of the things I always used to do when coaching clients on filling out the form, and you might still want to do that, when you have the form in front of you and it talks about the office, with respect, you must file this, cross that out and just write the village board or the township board or the school district or whatever,
Mhm.
because then it makes it easier to understand. So that hasn't changed. And generally, the fact that the statute still doesn't accomplish the purpose that they're really trying to get it to accomplish, that hasn't changed. But I don't think we want them to work on this anymore, because they seem to make it worse instead of better.
And a good thing about the instructions, some things that you should bring with you, have in front of you when you are reviewing this forms, or your tax return, federal tax return, any brokerage statements that you have, financial investment statements. Um, and you might need to talk to your financial advisor to help you understand how to respond to these questions, to some of these questions, because some of the definitions, as you'll see, will get very technical, which is a great segue, I think. Um, just ask me. I'm the host. I'm complimenting my own segues. Is question one
But
on this form, Carrie
but
Lynn,
but before we get there, Dan, we should talk about the one final thing that hasn't changed, which is where do you file these documents?
county clerk, if you're local government folks. And you know what? We've been getting some questions about from folks that are filing with their county clerks that their online filing system looks a little bit different than the one that's than the forms that we're talking about here today. So if uh, the the form you're completing with the county clerk is not the exact same what we're talking about here today. The county clerk's form only has to substantially comply with the statute. So if it's not identical, for example, I've had multiple people ask me, like, my form says to answer NA instead of none, and the statute says none. I'm like, well, gee whiz, that's substantially pretty close. But and that's on the form that the county clerk provided, and that's probably fine. The
And
statute
yeah,
does say none.
two other comments about that. First of all, sometimes you have a public body that's located in more than one county. So in that instance, you file it with the county clerk in the county where your principal governmental office is located. But also, we know that we have a lot of members of the judiciary that are signing into this live stream, and judicial offices are very special also. So if you're a candidate for state office or judicial office, then you are not filing with the county, you're filing with the Secretary of State. And they have their own form, and you may or may not be able to use the internet to file that form, kind of depending on what happens. So this year the deadline for the forms is Monday, May 2nd, and we hope that you'll all complete your documents by then. So yes, Dan, I've ruined your beautiful segue, but please go into question number one.
Question number one, we're back. It's and this is the one we've maybe gotten the most questions about. Question one: if you have any single asset that was worth more than $10,000 as of the end of the preceding calendar year and is held in or payable to your name, held jointly by or payable to you with your spouse, or held jointly by or payable to you with your minor child, list such assets below. In case of investment real estate, list the city and state where the investment real estate is located. If you do not have any such assets, list none below. Now, that is maybe not in the language that we commonly understand, but and actually the real issue here is this question uses words that are commonly understood to mean different things, um, like asset, but you'll see the definitions of asset. It excludes a lot. Asset means an item that is owned or and has monetary value. Sounds pretty broad, right? Assets include, but are not limited to, stocks, bonds, sector mutual funds, sector exchange traded funds, commodity futures, investment real estate, beneficial interests and trusts, business interests, and partnership interests. But listen to all this stuff that it doesn't include. Assets do not include personal residences, personal vehicles, savings or checking accounts, bonds, notes, or securities issued by any branch of federal, state, or local government. Medicare benefits, inheritances, or bequests other than beneficial interests and trusts, diversified funds, annuities, pensions, including government pensions, retirement accounts, college saving plans that are qualified tuition plans, qualified tax advantage savings programs that allow individuals to save for disability related expenses, or tangible personal property. Carrie Lynn, that's a big deal. The assets, not assets distinction to answer this question. Your thoughts?
Well, yes. So this is the number one reason why public officials' heads have been exploding, and we've been getting phone calls, and people have been threatening to resign, because when you look at that first part, what's an asset? Oh man, if I have to divulge every single asset, that's like a lot of things. But especially like assets more than $10,000. Well, what if I have an antique piece of furniture and it's over $10,000? Well, the devil here is in the details. So the most important part of this definition is not the assets, but like as Dan pointed out, it's what's not an asset. And
Right.
so like you have to disclose all this stuff, but you really don't. You can take a deep breath. You don't have to disclose your resident, your vehicle, your bank accounts, your stocks, everything like that. So you see from this helpful little chart that we have up here, what has to be disclosed and what doesn't.
And listeners at home, if you're listening on the podcast later on, you're going to want to um, check out the resource center at anselclink.com. We'll include this PowerPoint there for you to review later. Question in the chat: what if someone owns property with their siblings that is not an investment property, but not someone's private residence? Interesting question. Um, really, really fact specific. Um, if it's not an investment property, let's take a look at the definition of investment property, shall we? Thank you, listener, for that lovely segue. Investment real estate means any real property other than the filer's personal residences purchased to produce a profit, whether from income or real resale. Investment real estate may be described by the city and state where the real estate is located. So um, the asset, the question, and then let's look at the question. What does the question ask for? If you have any single asset that was worth more than $10,000 at the end of the preceding calendar year, is it held by you, your name, payable to you, your spouse, or your minor child? This property is held by siblings. This is a close question. You should take a closer look at it. Probably shouldn't shoot from the hip and riff on it on a podcast, of course. But I think those are the things to think about and look at when you're considering those kinds of assets. I I think it's not a personal residence, so I think it very well could be considered investment real estate. And even though it's not held, you hold part of it with siblings and not a spouse or minor child. Um, remember the advice that hasn't changed over the years completing these forms is that it doesn't hurt to over disclose. And if you think you might need to disclose it, it doesn't hurt to just list the city and state where this real estate is located. It's not a big deal.
So with that question, what if someone owns property with their siblings? I guess we would need to know, is the title partially in the name of the public official? And
Right.
also what's the overall value of the asset? Because it looks like you would not fit in the exception that it's not a personal residence. And when it talks about investment real estate, that is within the definition of assets. So that would be something that I probably would err on the side of disclosing.
Yeah.
But again, talk to your specific legal counsel with your additional details about how that property is titled. And you can never go, let's say also, regardless of what we say, you can never go wrong in over disclosing, right?
Yep.
The problem is people don't want to answer questions that are particularly invasive. And I can already tell from additional questions that we're getting in the chat that that's what some people are worried about. So Dan, why don't you maybe handle some of those other questions before we move forward?
Yeah. Question in the chat: does this mean every single stock, bond, etc.? Oh my gosh, there's so many. More. Dear listener, I just found the chat. So now I'm seeing the more questions pop up. Does this mean every single stock, bond, etc.? Read the question. It says every single asset that was worth more than $10,000. So is the single stock worth more than $10,000? Single bond worth more than $10,000? That's something you should look at with your with your investment statements, brokerage statements, and the whole idea of the form, right, is that like you have a single source that you own enough of this stock or bond that might influence you in your affairs, and you should disclose that. Carrie Lynn?
Yes. So My mom a long time ago bought me 1 share of McDonald's stock. I don't know, so I could get dividend checks for $3 like once a year. So no, I wouldn't have to disclose that single stock because it's not in excess of $10,000. Now, many people have investment accounts, and that's different than the single stocks and bonds. But if you do have a single stock or a single bond in excess of $10,000, you have to disclose it. But if you have a lot of things totaling over 10,000 cumulatively, no, because that wouldn't meet this definition.
Very nice. Uh, Carrie Lynn, anything else jumping out you in the chat that we want to touch on before we move on from question one? I know that we've got a bunch more questions to address, and maybe we can circle back at the end if we have time.
All right. Well, so this looks like there's a lot of questions here also related to investments. So my Roth IRA doesn't have to be disclosed, but my stock investment does. Well, again, if your stock investment is over $10,000, it would have to be disclosed. What if a trust in my name owns a mutual fund? Well, this gets one step beyond that. So no, if there's a trust in your name and it owns a mutual fund, then you have to look at all of the non-assets and, kind of the diversified funds. And this is something what I would do if you want to just print this out, the definition, and take it to your accountant. We've had some clients do that so they could kind of review their individual issues with that. But if it's a trust and they own a mutual fund, again, you'd have to look at the values of the individual stocks and see if you fall within that. Probably not, I would say. Let's see here.
And another point, while you sift through the chat again, another important point you mentioned values, Carrie Lynn, is that the questions are asking for the source. You're listing you list interests and not amounts, and so you don't have to put down the dollar values of these assets. You have to disclose them if they exceed that dollar value threshold, and they fit within the statute. But again, you're disclosing interests, and it's a statement of economic interest, not the dollar values. Carrie Lynn?
Yes, exactly. And, so just to kind of hit some more of these questions here, will this podcast be recorded? Yes, it will. What will happen if we don't disclose property? Well, that's a tricky one because how are they going to regulate compliance with this? Technically, you're supposed to comply with it. Now, we know that if you're a candidate running for office, even if you can file a completely false form, the consequence isn't removal from the ballot. The consequence is under the statute that you haven't complied with the technical requirements of that. All right, let's see here. What will happen if we don't? All right, if I'm a partner in my own business, would that be considered a business interest or a partnership interest? Yes, that would be considered that.
That's on the list.
Exactly. Now, here's a great question. How do you list the asset on the application, Dan?
When you list the asset, you list the source. If it's a investment real estate, you list the city and state. That's it. If you list if it's an asset, you just list the source and not the amount.
Then we're also getting some great questions about why was this disclosure requirement added? And I think if we zoom out a little bit and talk about that, it might be helpful. I mean, the purpose of this whole law to start out with, it's a part of the greater local governmental ethics act. It's to try to pinpoint whether or not people have conflicts of interest with respect to the unit of local government that they're involved in. So you'll see when we get to additional questions on the form, they're trying to determine what is your interaction. Are you contracting with the state and you're a state official? Do you own assets that the government's trying to engage in a contract with you? That originally was the purpose of this. And they tried to refine the disclosure obligation. So that's what the purpose of the disclosure requirement was. And they want to try to, like, for example, we have this scandal in the state about ComEd in Chicago and contracts with ComEd, right? So they want to know, like, oh, okay, are you you own 90% of ComEd and really or any particular company, and you just voted to award a contract to that company. That's the purpose behind that. And the next question is, does this apply to state officials also? Yes, it does. So all of our members of the General Assembly have to also
Yep.
file the same thing.
Very good, Carrie Lynn. I noticed we're almost halfway through our time and we're not even off of our first question. So maybe we could touch base on a few more of these questions later, because I know we're going to get more questions as we go along. Question 2, excluding the position for which you are required to file this form, list the source of any income in excess of $7,500 required to be reported during the preceding calendar year if you sold an asset that produced more than $7,500 in capital gains in the preceding calendar year. List the name of the asset and the transaction date on which the sale or transfer took place. If you had no such sources of income or assets, list none below. This question is maybe, in terms of ranking the number of questions that we get, this is question 2 is number 2 on that list. Income means pension income, and any income from whatever source derived required to be reported on the filer's federal income tax return. Sounds pretty broad, but the answer is easy. It was look at what was reported on your filer's federal income tax return. So look what's on there. Compensation received for services rendered to, or to be rendered. So look at your W-2, 1099, K-1, earnings on capital gains from the sale of assets, profit, interest or dividend income from all assets, revenue or leases or rentals, royalties, prizes, awards. If you won your NCAA tournament pool recently, listener, just kidding. Forgiveness of debt, earnings derived from annuities trust. But again, look at this. Income does not include compensation earned for service in the position that necessitates the filing, or interest returns on items excluded from the definition of asset, or income from the sale of a personal residence or vehicle. So again, you got to read this real carefully to understand what's not included. Right, Caroline?
Here is our number 1 tip about question number 2. Remember, this form is seeking for you to disclose your assets and everything related to the previous calendar year. So that year is over, and you have filed your tax returns related to that year already.
Right.
So that's why it's so easy to answer this question if you just look at your tax return, because that's the key to responding to question number 2.
Important tip. Thank you for sharing. Any final thoughts on question 2? Because question 3 is on the way. With that, listener at home, Carrie Lynn's giving me a big thumbs up, and she just held up a sign that says you're doing a great job. Thank you, Carrie Lynn. Question 3, excluding debts incurred on terms available to the general public. Let's stop right there. Look at that big exclusion at the top. I don't know about you, listener, but I incur debt on terms available to the general public. I personally don't have any debts from other sources. So regular consumer debt, this question's not asking about it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But here we go. Excluding debts incurred on terms available to the general public, such as mortgages, student loans, and credit card debts. So not those. If you owed any single debt in the preceding calendar year exceeding $10,000, list the creditor of the debt below. If you had no such debts, list none below. So that's and then list the creditor for all applicable debts owed by you, owed jointly by you with your spouse, owed jointly by you with your minor child. In addition to these types of debts listed above, you do not need to report any debts to or from financial institutions, government agencies such as debts secured by automobiles, household furniture, or appliances, so long as the debt was made on terms available to the general public. Debts to members of your family, or debts to or from a political committee registered with the Illinois State Board of Elections, or any political committee, uh, principal campaign committee, or authorized committee registered with the Federal Election Commission. In terms of power rankings, in terms of the from the in terms of power ranking, the number of questions we get from folks, uh, number three is number three after questions 1 and 2, and it all has to do with the distinction about what's a debt and what's not a debt, right, Carrie Lynn?
Right. And this is another question that people freak out about that you don't need to freak out about, because 99% of your debts are not going to be disclosable under this question if you actually go through it. Because most of us, the kind of debt that we have, it's our mortgage or our car payment or our credit card bills. And those you don't have to disclose. So don't worry about this question. It's not as bad as you think. I mean, you do have to disclose things if you have a personal loan to a friend, and they're trying to really make sure you haven't accepted a bribe from someone. I mean, that's kind of
Right.
what this question is going to. So again, don't worry about this question, and hopefully you're seeing a pattern of, once you look at the question and then actually see what is excluded from it, it's really not as bad as you think.
Right, but I do want to respond to the folks in the chat that are saying that it's still not easy to answer these questions. I agree with you. We're not saying it's easy. We're saying it's easier once you look at the definitions. It's still a real pain. I appreciate all the frustration that local government folks are having
And people are
with these
also asking
filers.
about, well, if we do decide not to resign and we fill out this form, how accessible is it? Well, it's a public record,
Hmm.
so people will have the ability to look at it. I will tell you that generally people do not request to view these forms at all unless it has to do with an election contest. I don't think I've heard of any situations outside of an election contest where someone is requested to view these, although it might be possible. So you should know that it will be a public record, but it's not, it's not usually outside of a governmental ethics thing. People usually don't request to review these for like no reason.
Right. They're publicly available, and then but let's keep in mind what the responses are. They're not dollar amounts. They're just lists of interests. So they should be very boring to read. Questions in the chat. We'll post these slides to the resource center at anselglink.com after today's live stream. If you're listening to this on the podcast later, you that will be in your recent past, dear listener, and will already be on the resource center at anselglink.com. And listeners in the live stream, if you want to listen to this again, perhaps reading these definitions will be some kind of sleep aid for you, or and you can listen to these at your convenience. This recording will be available at quorumforum.anselglink.com as soon after this live stream.
And as Dan transitions into our next question, I'm going to answer one of our other questions here is, would shareholdings in a specific company that total over 10,000 have to be listed? For example, 100 shares of a company with a total value over 10,000. Yes, most likely that would have to be, because they're trying to see how much of an ownership interest you have in a particular company that you might end up doing governmental business with.
Well said. Let's touch on question 4 on the form. List the name of each unit of government of which you or your spouse were an employee, contractor, or office holder during the preceding calendar year, other than the unit or units of government in relation to which the person is required to file, and the title of the position or nature of the contractual services. Carrie Lynn, I feel like these questions are getting easier, don't you think?
They are, but I think people are still angry.
Yeah, I want to let you all listeners. I want to let you all know your feelings are valid, and we agree with you. And but I think questions 1, 2, and 3 are by far the most headache-inducing, and this one is pretty straightforward. The if you don't if you're you don't have to list the unit of government in relation to which you're filing. So if you like work for a village, you don't have to list the village you're filing in relation to. Or if your spouse works for the village, you don't have to even list that either, because it's still the um, same unit of government which you're filing in relation to. They want to know if you or your spouse uh, work for or another uh, unit of government, or you're a contractor, an office holder for another unit of government. And then in that case, you just have to list the position uh, or the nature of the contractual services. Any thoughts, more thoughts about question 4, Carrie Lynn?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty self-explanatory.
Love it.
While you're transitioning to 5, then I want to handle another question that comes up, because this is, we do kind of have a farm theme to today's presentation, and we're getting questions about farmland and farm equipment, and we've been getting a lot of questions about these generally, mostly from our township officials. So do we list farmland and farm machinery? Well, first of all, a farm would be an item that is owned and has monetary value. So that would be a reason why you would list it, except when it depends, right? Because assets do not include personal residence. So is the property your personal residence?
Right.
So, I mean, how are we defining farm? Farm isn't actually defined in the statute, which is why I think we're getting so many questions about that. So if you own a farm and don't live on it, then it's an asset that would probably need to be disclosed. If it's a personal resident, you wouldn't have to. Farm equipment, though, if you go way down to the bottom, see where it says tangible personal property under not assets? Farm equipment, I think, would fit under tangible personal property. But if it's a farm business, then again, you would have to disclose that under an asset. So it's hard to answer the question, do I list farm land and farm machinery without knowing, okay, do you live on the farm? How are you operating that? Is it personal or not? I think there's good arguments for not listing them as assets if you're living on the property and it's tangible personal property.
Right.
But again, go through those particulars of your situation with your accountant and apply the screen that Dan has pulled up on the slide right now, and you should be able to answer that question.
In the there was a question about penalties earlier, and there are penalties for not filing on time, or for not making responses. But there's that safe harbor for making for good faith responses in good faith reliance on the Secretary of State guidance, and we talked about that earlier. The guidance doesn't say much, but review it and prepare good faith responses, and you should be in a good position to comply with the law. So that and this will be the most difficult year, because next year hopefully the form will be the same, but and not worse. But you'll have a better idea of how to answer this new or respond to this new form.
And we just had a question related to question number 4, which is, if my spouse works for a different unit of government than I do I have to list her, or I have to list her, and she would have to list me? My wife's unit of local government isn't showing in the list. Well, question 4 says list the name of each unit of local government of which you or your spouse were an employee. So yeah, for if she was an employee during the previous year, you would have to list it. If she's required to fill out and file this form, then she would also have to disclose you. So when you say her governmental unit isn't showing in the list.
Yeah, I wonder if that's the online form and it's not showing up. I think there's there's often a way to attach additional sheets or submit additional sheets for those responses. But that's a good question to raise with the county that prepared the online form about how you would address that in your response. And does the other governmental unit have to be in Cook County to matter? I don't think so. I think it's asking for each unit of government, and so it's not limited to Cook County. Say if you're a Cook County filer, and you're filing in Cook County, right, Carrie Lynn?
That is correct.
Question 5: if you maintain an economic relationship with a lobbyist, or if a member of your family is known to be a lobbyist registered with any unit of government in the state of Illinois, List the name of the lobbyist below and identify the nature of your relationship with the lobbyist. If you do not have an economic relationship with a lobbyist or a family member known to you to be a lobbyist registered with any unit of government in the state of Illinois, list none below. Now, this question, another important one to look at the definitions. Economic relationship has a special meaning, means any joint or shared ownership interest in business or creditor debtor relationships with third parties other than commercial lending institutions, where the filer is entitled to receive 7.5% more than that of the total distributive income or an amount in excess of the salary of the governor. Um, you would have to look that up. I don't think that the more you read this definition, the fewer people it sounds like it applies to. The filer, together with his or her spouse or minor children, is entitled to receive more than 15% in the aggregate of the total distributive income or an amount in excess of 2 times the salary of the governor. Folks, remember they're talking about economic relationship with a lobbyist, or a family member known to you to be a lobbyist. So that's the sandbox we're playing in. Lobbyist is who you think it is. It's somebody registered to be a lobbyist under the Lobbyist Registration Act. And but family actually has a broader meaning than you might think. It means a filer's spouse, children, got it, stepchildren, typical parents, step parents, siblings, step siblings, fine. Half siblings, sons-in-law, okay, getting a little extended. Daughters-in-law, grandparents and grandchildren, okay, as well as the parents and grandparents of the filer's spouse, all right, and any person living with the filer. So the guy on your couch that is couch surfing for an extended period of time um, is like family to you. But keep in mind, again, this question only cares about family to the extent that the member of your family, is known to you to be a lobbyist.
Right. So really the takeaway here is if you have a lobbyist in the family, tell them to, to keep that a secret.
No.
I mean, so that really is the biggest takeaway for question number 5. In addition, I have a middle school student who just took the Illinois Constitution test. So the governor's salary is $177,412. So if you want to perform that calculation, go to a middle school student and they will be able to help you.
That's very nice. What else? I think that's it for question 5. So that again, that question is not hard if you read it carefully, and understand what they're asking for. I think you're going to be in good shape.
And I think we've received 0 questions about this question.
Yeah. These as these questions go on, they apply to fewer people, but we're duty bound to review them. Question 6. List the name of each person, organization, or entity that was the source of a gift or gifts or honorarium or honoraria valued singly or in the aggregate in excess of $500 received during the preceding calendar year, and the type of gift or gifts or honorarium or honoraria, um, excluding any gift or gifts from a family member of your family that was not known to be a lobbyist registered with any unit of government in the state of Illinois. If you had no such gifts, list none. Again, family has that broad definition, but they only care about gifts, disclosing gifts from family members that were known to you to be a lobbyist. So if you're getting gifts valued at in excess of $500, that's good for you, Carrie Lynn.
I don't think really I have anything I can add to this. I think you've said it all. And I do want to say, though, if you're wondering why Dan is reading everything in front of you, it's not really actually to bore you. It's because we will have people listening to this later who do not have the definitions in front of them for reference. So that's why we're reviewing them.
That is true. And I am also doing it to kind of like I think it's soothing to hear the I fall asleep reading statutes all the time. I think it's got a real calming effect. Although this form is very alarming for a number of individuals, but um, uh, I'm curious about the definitions. Are those in the statute themselves, or are those legal definitions of these terms? Question from the chat. The definitions are in the statute. It's the Illinois Governmental Ethics Act. Should you care to wade into the act itself? But we've selected the most important definitions for to help you answer these questions. Talk about here today. And this is but before we open it up to more questions from the chat, folks listening on the live stream, please we're gonna have a little bit of time for questions here at the end. Please do share your questions with us about statements of economic interest in the chat. Also was looking for more compliments for the host. That is another thing that we were looking for in the chat. That's very appreciated. But anyways, question 7, list the name of any spouse or immediate family member living with the person making this statement employed by a public utility in the state of Illinois, and the name of the public utility that employs the relative. Carrie Lynn mentioned ComEd earlier. That might have inspired this question. You've got the regular definitions that we've already reviewed about that definition of spouse, the broad definition of family. But let's take a look at the definition of public utility. It's the definition everyone knows from the Public Utilities Act. Nobody knows that, but it includes, but is not limited to, every corporation, company, limited liability company, association, lots of different organizations that owns, controls, operates, or manages in Illinois, directly or indirectly, for public use, any plant, equipment, or property used or to be used for, in connection with, or owns or controls any franchise, license, permit, or right to engage in the production, storage, transmission, sale, delivery, or furnishing of heat, cold, power, electricity, water, light, except when used solely for communication purposes, the disposal of sewerage, or the conveyance of oil or gas by pipeline. But public utilities does not include those that are owned and operated by any political subdivision, public institution of higher education, or municipality in Illinois, or public utilities that are owned by political subdivisions, public institutions of higher learning, of higher education, or a municipality. Carrie Lynn, this question probably applies to very few people, and it applies to even fewer when you notice that the definition of public utility doesn't include those owned or operated by municipalities or any political subdivision, right?
Yes. So again, I guess this goes to show us that the General Assembly did intend for this legislation also to apply to themselves. So they're not just trying to torment public officials and smaller units of local government. But I think this was directly related to the ComEd scandal, and again, trying to divulge whether or not people are contracting with companies they have an interest in. So I think that is another question that we have not received any questions about. And thank you to all of the Ansel Link former recovering employees and current employees who are making nice comments. We will definitely remember that as like when we're reviewing, salary adjustments at the end of the year and everything.
Oh my gosh.
We have another question here. If I work for one unit of government and I'm a member of another unit, do I need to file for 2 forms, or does listing them as other offices cover me? If both of the positions are positions with respect, you're supposed to file, you would have to do two separate ones, because some of the questions are seeking you to disclose any interest you have in relation to that particular unit. So you would have to file that for both. Other
Question
questions?
question about income. Does Social Security need to be listed as an income source in response to question 2? Looking at the definition, I've pulled it up. Um, it, if it Now remember, the definition of income is from whatever source derived that was required to be reported on your federal income tax form. Did you report Social Security as income on your income tax return? I have not had the privilege of receiving Social Security yet, and I very much hope to receive it someday. But if it's reported on your tax return, that's the key to answering that question. Um, and remember, for question 2, you're disclosing the you're disclosing uh, the source, so, and not the amount. So if that's something that needed to be reported on your federal income tax return, you would list Social Security as just the source. Uh, other questions from the chat, Carrie Lynn? More compliments are rolling in, and I'm so pleased that our effort to fish for compliments was successful, and it genuinely does mean a lot to us. But
All right, who created these new questions, and what were they trying to accomplish, assuming they were that just being annoying or intrusive wasn't the objective? Well, this does come to us compliments of our friends in the Illinois General Assembly, and the statute actually contains these forms. So this wasn't something that like just someone on the side put together. It was a collective legislative act, sadly, and they really were trying to, well, okay, I'll tell you what I think they were trying to do. I think that there's been a clamor for increased accountability in government. And I think that there was pressure for ethics reform, and that this was partially a reaction to that. That here we can say that we updated the ethics form, and this is why. Now I know that it's very distressing to see how sausage is made in Springfield. And I've talked to some legislators that we represent who were very vexed about some of the questions in these forms too, because it will surprise you all that not every piece of legislation that's enacted has everybody reading every single page and thinking of the implications. But I think overall they were trying to improve governmental accountability, and they were thinking about that more on a statewide basis, and they weren't really thinking about the problems that this was going to pose to local government officials, many of whom, especially if you're appointed to something, why are you doing it for the big bucks, right? No, of course not. You're doing it because you're committed to public service. And that's why this form is so distressing, because here you're already putting time that you didn't expect you were going to have to put into your governmental public service job. And now you have this thing that looks really, really intrusive. But hopefully what you're realizing is we're going through this is that, well, it sounds worse than it is. And it's going to be a little bit of a headache to comply with it, but they're not asking for your bank account numbers or your balances or your credit card bills or anything like that. And you might have to disclose that, yeah, you own some stock. And I represent a lot of public officials that own a lot of things, and I've been through these forms with them, and there's not a lot they really have to disclose. So once you get through the original shock and trauma of it, it's kind of easy to do. It really is. So take heart that it's really not intended to torment public officials or to be incredibly invasive and personally attacking. It's not really supposed to be that. So hopefully, as you work through it with your attorneys and your financial advisors, you'll see that, oh, you know what? We own a lot of things, but most of this is not disclosable, mostly because our family member is a secret lobbyist or whatever. And hopefully you'll be able to complete these forms with much less distress and duress than you originally contemplated.
Yes. It's intimidating at first, and maybe is intimidating during, but hopefully, on- once you complete the form, just make a good faith effort, like the statute says, um, and read the definitions and the questions carefully, and maybe this will be the worst year. I think that you'll have to do it because you'll have a better understanding what they're looking for next year. Question from the chat. I think this has to do with question two. Uh, is it just asking for the filer's income, or does that include spousal income as well? Again, I think this is about whether it was reported on the filer's federal income tax return. Did you file jointly? If it's on there, I think it's reasonable to disclose the interest, um, or disclose the source of the income. If it doesn't show up on your tax return, they're not asking about it, right, Carolyn?
I believe that's correct.
Uh,
And then we're also getting more questions and comments like, if I have to consult with an attorney or accountant, they're going to bill me. Will the authors of this form pay for this? Of course not, because it's an unfunded mandate, right? Again, okay, sorry. We could do a whole live stream on unfunded mandates. That would be really fun too.
we could.
Okay, and then another question from one of our friends. Would a pull behind camper purchased on an installment contract worth over $10,000 need to be disclosed? Well, again, we have to go back and look at the definition. So
Right.
it would fall with an asset, right? So, but do you consider that to be a personal vehicle?
And I think it's tangible personal property too. Two famous non-assets in the list of assets. You notice the kind. I know the definition of asset says anything that has monetary value, but then the list of examples they give, those are all like financial instruments, right? The tangible personal property, personal vehicles, they're not concerned about those. Those are specifically excluded from the definition of asset. I don't think a pull behind camper. Um, uh, the personal residence angle. I didn't think about that. You could live in it. And that's another famous non-exclusion: personal residence,
Yeah,
personal vehicle, tangible personal property. I'm thinking there's many ways to exclude the camper from the definition of asset.
yeah. I think also that if it's an installment contract worth over $10,000, that's one of those debts that's not really a debt that's disclosable either. So I think you're okay on both sides of not reporting that.
Carrie Lynn, we're getting short on time and short on questions from the chat, so we've fulfilled our duty to have public comment at this regular meeting. Do you have any upcoming publications? This is the Department of Public Works. Do you have any upcoming publications, speeches, conferences that coming up that you'd like to tell the listeners about?
Oh, we at Answer Link always have lots of stuff lining up. Like, what the first thing you should know is that if you are a township official, the Township Officials Laws and Duties Handbook has been updated, and we're currently unable to print it because the paper for the publisher is stuck on a truck in Canada due to the pandemic. So the supply chain has not fully recovered. And then, as always, we're doing some webinars on this topic again for township officials coming up. We have lots of podcasts, Dan, coming up. We have other Ansel Link podcasts coming up. We have, we have all sorts of things on our lineup.
Another beautiful segue, Carrie Lynn, on April 6th. Those of you in the live stream, that's tomorrow for listeners in the live stream. Quorum Forum podcast will be live at Haymarket Pub and Brewery at 3:30 p.m. for the APA CMS bar exam, a realistic law school simulation that takes place in a bar. We're talking to planners about planning law, the most important planning law cases of the year for them to know. One of my favorite events of the year, and we'll be recording it for Ansel Link's Quorum Forum podcast. So all you listeners, if you can't make it, you'll hear it on a future podcast episode. That's if Engineer Rick successfully records it, and I hope he successfully remembered to hit record today for this very episode. Again, folks in the chat, the PowerPoint will be available in the resource center at anselglink.com. once I tell Rick to post it there once we get off the stream. Carrie Lynn, thank you for joining me today. Any final thoughts before we adjourn?
I have no final thoughts left after this topic. I want to congratulate the audience on sticking with us through this, because it's hard to make a webinar or live stream of a very fact specific, legally intensive, definition broad kind of material. So thank you for sticking through to the end. We know that you're out there trying to do the best that you can for your residents in your community, and thank you for what you do as far as public service.
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Carrie Lynn. Thank you, listeners in the chat. Thank you, listeners at home, for tuning in. Before we go, I want to remind everyone to subscribe and leave us a review wherever podcasts are heard. We prefer good reviews. Email us your questions and show ideas to podcast@anselglink.com. And as always, you can visit us online at quorumforum.anselglink.com. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second, all in favor, the ayes have it. We'll see you next time on Ansel Link's Quorum Forum podcast. Bye.